In this section we're going to look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are clearly some sort of follow-on to the books of Chronicles. We shall also make space to look at the book of Esther because, well, essentially we haven't got anywhere else to put her. 2 Kings stops just after the fall of Jerusalem and the beginning of the exile in Babylon. The obvious conclusion to draw is that the book was written at the very earliest during the exile. Other considerations suggest that a lot of editorial work on various documents was going on during the exile, including, presumably, the books of Kings. 2 Chronicles ends with the decree of Cyrus, which was the official ending of the exile, although we know that exiles were slow to take advantage of the opportunity to return home. Some were still there a century later, or at least their descendants were. But we deduce that the work of the chronicler was later than the writing of 2 Kings. Jewish tradition has it that it was very much later, some centuries later. Jewish Bibles, for instance, are arranged in sections, and the chronicler's work is put in the miscellaneous and latecomers section at the end, suggesting that it was done well after the contents of the other sections had been settled. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are clearly taking the story of the nation beyond the exile in Babylon into the restoration of Jerusalem. They have a lot in common with the chronicler's work, and the obvious reading is that they're a continuation of his work into the return and restoration of Jerusalem. Our 3 samples are from the book of Ezra, something about the confession of sin, from Nehemiah, the return to Jerusalem, and from Esther, Esther becomes queen. So the first sample in the book of Ezra, we'll be moving to Ezra chapter 10. Ezra is an interesting figure. In the Bible, his story occupies not very much space at all, and he's not someone that Christians spend an awful lot of time talking about, but the Jews do. When Jews read their scriptures, Ezra is the model of what they want their rabbis to be. Someone who knows the ancient scriptures, someone who's sad when the people don't follow what the scriptures say, someone who calls people back into line with their old established ways. Ezra is an upholder of tradition, with the scriptures being the main definition of that tradition. The return from Babylon to Jerusalem stretched over at least 100 years, unbelievably. The stories of Ezra and Nehemiah are not easy to put dates to, not even easy to arrange in a convincing order. So in our kind of study, we must be content to take a story on its own, just to know that it took place sometime fairly early in the reoccupation of Jerusalem. The pattern of their history had been this. They'd been given the covenant and its law. They'd been given the job of living by that law, but had seriously messed up. The exile in Babylon had been the kind of punishment designed not just to make them suffer, but even more to call them back to their senses. So when the King Cyrus sounded the off, you'd expect the Jews to return to Jerusalem full of zeal for their God, absolutely determined not to let him down this time. But not a bit of it. They dribbled back to Jerusalem, most of them quite clearly preferring the life they'd made for themselves in the ghetto in Babylon. And those who did return weren't exactly paragons of virtue, but had lived almost as if the law of Moses had never been given to them. So the first significant thing that Ezra did was to read them some chunks of that law, so they could no longer claim not to know what it said. As for Ezra himself, he was beside himself with grief at the way his countrymen had behaved. He was deeply in mourning for his nation. If you'd read Ezra chapter 10, the first 4 verses. Verse 1. It was obvious what Ezra was doing, and quite a crowd of people with some spiritual discernment joined with him. They were expressing their grief. You know how Middle Eastern people express grief. They're not quiet or understated. They must have made quite a racket. Verse 2. Then one of the men put into words what their expression of grief was really about. They'd heard Ezra read the law of Moses, and they realized that their own lives didn't match up to that law. The most obvious thing about how they'd carried on during and after the exile was the number of them who had married foreign wives and even had children with them. But it says, in spite of this. The best kind of confession of sin is when at the very point where you realize you blundered, you also realize that the Lord is able to lead you through the mess out into a renewed life. That's fabulously important. There's no spot on earth which is so deep in the mire of sin that God cannot rescue you from that spot and lead you into a renewed life. He never says to you that he can't work with you starting from where you are now. Verse 3. There must have been quite a powerful anointing on that gathering, first to give rise to all that mourning, and then even more to lead those men to undertake to end their ungodly marriages. But that's just what they vowed to do. In verse 4, they called on Ezra to take the lead in it, assuring him that they were right behind him. So it was now a matter of how precisely they were going to handle it. If you'd read verses 5 to 17. Verse 5. Ezra made sure first that they all meant it. So they solemnly swore in each other's presence that this was what they were resolved to do. And with that oath they became answerable to each other and to the Lord. Verse 6. Ezra then gave himself some space. My guess is that he needed to let the ideas settle in his mind and take the shape of a practical plan. It's one thing to know what you've got to do. It can be quite another to know precisely how you're going to set about doing it. The one requires conviction, the other requires as well a deal of wisdom. Verse 7. Once Ezra knew how to do it, a proclamation went out. They needed a full National Assembly. They needed to make it clear that you had to be on your deathbed to have an excuse not to be there. Verse 9. So in 3 days all the men of the kingdom had gathered. Obviously the Bush Telegraph had been working overtime, and everyone knew why they were really there. Some would be sad because they realized how they let the Lord down. Some would be sad at the prospect of breaking up their families, and some were sad for both reasons. And to cap it all, it was absolutely pouring with rain. Verses 10 and 11. There was obviously nowhere indoors that a crowd of this size could go, so Ezra tried to make it snappy. He confirmed their suspicions as to why they were there, and called on them to confess their sins, not least over the business of foreign wives. In verse 12 he got a good response for them, but verse 13 there were a lot of nuts and bolts to see to. All the business of dissolving marriages and sort of working out precisely what to do. And they saw there was no point in trying to do that there outside in all that rain. At verse 14 they suggested that men should be appointed to administer and record the details, admitting, well, it's not going to be over in a few days, it'll take a while. Verse 15, apart from 2 or 3 awkward ones, everyone agreed on this way of handling. That gathering was no different from all those other places where it makes you say, well, there's always at least one. Well, there was there. Verse 16, so Ezra selected a small number of heads of families to lead the task, and they held court to receive the men who came to them. Verse 17, it all took several weeks, but they got it done. One of the quirks of the books of Chronicles is the author's fondness for lists. And we've got the same in Ezra and Nehemiah. We've got one here, recording an extract of the list of those who'd put away their foreign wives. I mean, have a look at verses 18 to 44. I don't see there's a need to read them in detail, but It's pretty much like reading the phone book, trying to read that sort of passage. But if you notice it's there, you can see that it has a serious purpose, namely that it helps to make clear that this is no made-up story. This incident involved actual people in grief, in heart-searching, in decision, and in the difficult business of undoing marriages and families. In today's society, we're all too painfully aware of the problems caused by broken families, especially the difficulties caused to the children, often seriously hampering their development and their education. So you might well hear this story of Ezra and think that what he did was an act of gross vandalism, wantonly causing this sort of damage on an industrial scale to the population of Judah. This therefore brings up the issue we noticed in our last study of the difference between doing a good thing and doing it in the way that God says it should be done. That difference is made all the more painful by the way that the Jews interpreted their laws and traditions. They laid enormous stress on their physical descent from their ancestors. Now, strangely, although the descent we usually read about is through the male line, their everyday preoccupation was in terms of who their mother was. The everyday definition of a Jew was of someone born to a Jewish mother. And I suppose that, to be fair, in practical terms, it was a lot easier to be sure exactly who someone's mother was than who the father was. For Ezra and those who sided with him, it was therefore a massive crisis of identity. For all those families involving a non-Jewish wife, none of their children could be counted as Jewish. Allowing that to remain unchallenged would wipe out a large part of the next generation, disqualifying them for counting as citizens of Judah. So within his own understanding of their physical and spiritual identity, you can perhaps sympathize with Ezra for taking this action. Now, all of that centers around the issue of identity and of its being decided in terms of physical descent. The chosen people of God had to be identified in their day as those who would trace their ancestry back to Abraham through mothers. Let's remember what Paul had to say about Abraham as an ancestor. In Romans 4, in language which not everyone finds easy to read, Paul talks about Abraham and picks out as his most important characteristic that he put his faith in God. That faith is what Paul sees as the centre of our identity as the people of Jesus. And he says that although we're not descended physically from Abraham necessarily, we are his descendants and his heirs in the matter of faith in Jesus. So for the Jews, physical identity and spiritual identity have to be one and the same thing. For Christians, they can be quite separate. Physically, we're descendants of Adam, but we've been set free from the bondage of sin and are therefore able to become sons and daughters of God along with his son Jesus. Physically, most of us are not descendants of Abraham, but as his heirs by faith, we can look to the magnificent heritage we find in the Old Testament and see it as in a very important sense our heritage, given to us as a part of our new identity in Jesus. So we're left taking some ideas out of the passage we've read, and left, I think, extremely grateful that we don't have to handle the same issues of physical descent in the way that was important for Ezra. But that concludes our first sampling from this book. Our second sample takes us to Nehemiah, to the book called Nehemiah, right from the very first verse. The scene is Babylon. The main bulk of the inhabitants of Jerusalem have been in exile there for more than 60 years. They've been given leave to return home, and a few of them have, but many of them are still in Babylon. By the look of it, those who had returned were living a hands-to-mouth existence in the ruins of the city of Jerusalem and hadn't really got their act together. The book Nehemiah contains what appears to be an account written by the man called Nehemiah, plus other material relating to his work. There's a mega argument as to when it all took place, but it's clearly long enough after the first exiles returned that they really ought to have got themselves organised by then. If you read, please, Nehemiah chapter 1, the first 11 verses. Verse 2. Nehemiah gets news from Jerusalem. Verse 3. It's not good news. Clearly, as a result of the invasion decades earlier, the city walls are in ruins, the city gates have been burnt. That is, the basic elements of the city's security are simply not there. That's a twin problem, that the walls are in ruins and that no one there seems able to stir themselves to do anything about it. Verse 4. Nehemiah is clearly someone who can't hear of a problem and shrug it off, assuming that someone else will see to it. It weighs on his heart, and he knows he must do something. Weeping, fasting, and prayer over a matter of days seem to him to be step one. Perhaps the fasting element deserves a mention. There are two possible explanations. One is that he fasted as a way of concentrating all his attention on prayer, a technique, if you like, for amplifying prayer, a servo mechanism applied to prayer. The other possibility is that he was so stricken with grief that he wasn't really interested in food, and that fasting was one element of his grieving. If I had to guess, I'd go for the second plus a bit of the first one, but we don't really know. Verse 5. It reached a point where he knew what it was that he wanted to ask the Lord in prayer. You might recognise his position before that, needing to be before the Lord in prayer, but by no means clear as to specific things you wanted to ask for. His prayers then were largely involving the Lord in his grieving. But then he got to the point of realising that he knew what he wanted to ask for. Verses 5 and 6. There are two kinds of confession in these verses. There's confession of faith and there's confession of sins. It's a confession of faith that he declares that the God he's praying to has committed himself to his people in a covenant of love, and to such a God it's obviously worth bringing prayers for those people. He moves then to confession of sins. It didn't take a huge prophetic gifting to be aware that the people were in a mess, because they'd so seriously let their God down. Before the exile, prophets had warned that the nation was so far from living in the Lord's way that his wrath was bound to fall on them. And as the official exile ended, other prophets had announced that the Lord was ready to say they'd served their punishment and should now return to normal relationships with him. Nehemiah could see that some exiles had returned home, but what he heard of the condition they were in suggested they'd not returned to living under the Lord's blessing. Something was still clearly wrong. Verse 7. Confessing the nation's sin, Jeremiah cites the law of Moses. The covenant which the Lord had made with them was in effect their national constitution, and the law which Moses and others had put together spelt out what their national lifestyle ought to be. The fact is, they clearly had not valued the covenant and had not stuck to that proper lifestyle. Verses 8 and 9. Nehemiah gives his own summary of how the Lord had made it clear to Moses that the people needed to toe the line, or some sort of exile would be their obvious punishment. He also summarised the prophecies which declared that such a punishment would have a definite end and be followed by a restoration. Verse 11. Nehemiah held the position of the king's cupbearer. This meant that on a daily basis he had the king's ear, and he hoped that that position would enable him to do something about the state of his people. So he prays in general terms for such success. If now, please, you'd like to read the first 9 verses of chapter 2. Verse 1. Nehemiah takes the king's wine to him and is clearly somewhat glum. Court etiquette would obviously demand that even if you were a bit down, you shouldn't let it show to the king. But Nehemiah was so thoroughly glum that it did show, and the king remarked on it. That, of course, in verse 2, raises the stakes now massively. But verse 3, Nehemiah goes for it and confesses the cause of his deep sadness. Verse 4, the king then assumes that if there's a problem, then the people in his court will be wanting him to do something about it. So he opens himself to a suitable request. Before Nehemiah opens his mouth to reply, he sends a quick arrow prayer to the Lord. Probably little by way of content, just a massive nudge to remind the Lord of what he's already prayed about. The late John Wimber used to refer to such prayers as having the deeply theological content of help. If you ask the Lord to help, you've still got to launch out and do something yourself, otherwise there's nothing for him to help. Nehemiah's been given the chance to request the king's aid, so he goes for it. He asks to be sent on an official mission to Jerusalem with the king's commission to rebuild the city walls. Verse 6, the king asks for practical details like how long it will take, and Nehemiah obviously gave a sensible answer to that and then asked about some practicalities himself. Verse 7, he asked for royal letters giving him safe conduct. This would make it the governor's responsibility to ensure that Nehemiah was safe on his journey to Jerusalem. Verse 8, he also asked for a requisition order for timber to be used in the repairs, and now Nehemiah was obviously in good standing with the king, so it's not entirely surprising that the king received this request favourably. But Nehemiah had asked for quite a lot, and was more than ready to give the Lord credit for making that happen. He was faced with a thing that you've probably been faced with yourself. You ask the Lord to help you with something, and then the thing you've asked for help with actually goes quite well, and you're left in serious doubt as to why it went well. Did it go well because it wasn't so threatening as you thought it was, or did the Lord actually do exactly what you asked and help you in it? It is anyway good practice to give the Lord the benefit of the doubt. Verse 9. So Nehemiah took his letters to the governor of the region across which he had to travel, and he found that the king was so serious in seeing to Nehemiah's safety that he actually sent a troop of cavalry with him as the means by which the governor could protect him. Now, one of the recurring themes through Nehemiah's time in Jerusalem was ridicule and opposition from a small group of people led by one Sanballat. Their efforts to discourage him began as soon as they heard what he was up to. Will you read, please, just verse 10 in chapter 2. So he was up against all this, but it didn't stop him. And he arrived in Jerusalem, although no one knew why he was there. So after getting used to how things were, he conducted a round of inspection of the walls at night. If you'd like to read now verses 11 to 20. Verse 17. Nehemiah now reveals to those in Jerusalem why he's really there, and he calls on them to join him in rebuilding the walls. Verse 18, he's able to encourage them by telling them how his prayers had already been answered, so they'll join him in beginning the work. Verse 19, Sanballat and his crew then take some further verbal potshots at them. But 20, Nehemiah is able to answer them firmly and confidently. We can have particular confidence when we know that what we're doing is the direct result of something which the Lord has undertaken. On those occasions we can assume that there will be opposition, but we needn't let opposition rob us of our confidence and our courage. We can go back to the first chapter of Joshua about not being discouraged, not being robbed of your courage. To be protected in this way against discouragement, it's essential that we have a clear and explicit grasp of what it is that the Lord wants us to do. When you read the rest of Nehemiah's story, you discover that he also had to set in place some very practical measures to counter the opposition. He had to arrange that the builders were armed and ready to defend themselves against an attack at a moment's notice. This attitude of being clear as to the commission the Lord has given you and taking sensible practical steps to protect yourself is all of a piece with Oliver Cromwell's advice to his men to trust the Lord and keep their powder dry. You know, to trust the Lord and let your powder get wet would amount to putting the Lord your God to the test. It's such a memorable saying that I apologise for using such a warlike example as that, but it makes the point. And that brings us to the end of our second sample in these today's books. The books of Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah do appear to have come out of the same stable as each other. The book of Esther is not a part of the same collection, but we need a convenient spot in which to look at it, so that's what we're going to do now. And we're going to start working in chapter 2 of Esther. The book of Esther is quite funny. In fact, it's so funny that it's quite possible that it was written deliberately as a skit. If it was, then it makes it quite hard for us to be pompous about the connection between the story and how things actually happened. So we can take it for any moral or spiritual teaching it contains, although there is a serious debate as to whether there's any value in any historical evidence in the way the story is told. Perhaps the most hilarious bit is in chapter 1. It takes place in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, where King Xerxes was in show-off mood and gave a massive banquet which lasted a week. And the story is at pains to point out the vast quantity of wine consumed at the banquet. His queen Vashti gave a parallel banquet in her own apartments for the women of the palace. There's no mention of wine there. My guess is that she wasn't over-amused at her husband's display and that her banquet was a deal more civilised. Anyway, after 7 days of this junketing, the king and others in his banquet were well plastered, and Xerxes did a classic male chauvinist pig act. He sent a servant to fetch the queen, insisting that she should wear her full royal regalia so that he could show off her beauty to all his drunken revellers. The queen understandably would have none of it, and she refused to go. She probably didn't want to be amongst all those drunken men, and presumably didn't want to be shown off as an object, even an object of beauty. The king then got serious in the way that only a drunk can, and he took offence at her refusal and called a conference of his advisers. They were presumably also drunk, and they concluded 2 things. 1, that it was the Queen's duty to be obedient to the king, and 2, that unless something was done about it, her action would encourage women everywhere to disobey their husbands and so bring society into a state of chaos. So they decided that Vashti was never again to be in the king's presence, and that she should be replaced as queen. An edict was then sent throughout the kingdom describing what had happened and commanding all women to be obedient to their husbands. We pick up the story when the king's anger and, I presume, hangover had subsided somewhat. If you'd like to read chapter 2 of Esther, the first 14 verses. Verse 1, he remembered. I presume this means as he emerged from his hangover. Verses 2 to 4, they decided to hold a large-scale beauty contests to select the replacement queen. Verses 5 and 6, the story takes place after many Jews had returned to Jerusalem after exile in Babylon, but when sizable communities of Jews remained in exile. And here we find a community of them in Susa. Mordecai was one such Jew. His great-grandfather had been among the first batch to be captured in Jerusalem and taken into exile. That strikes me a little bit like those African Americans who can say that their great-grandfather was a slave. Even today, that fact plays a role in determining who they are and how they see their place in the world. It was like that with Mordecai. Verse 7. It was not unusual for people in exiled communities to have a name from their own culture and an alternative name which sounded easier in their host culture. That's why Mordecai's cousin had two names. We'll just call her Esther, and she was a beauty queen if ever there was one. Verse 8, and she was among those girls taken to the palace for the big contest. Verse 9, Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem, obviously spotted her as a likely winner and singled her out for special treatment. Now at this point you have to give a thought to how other people smell. I suspect you can class other people's smells in three groups. Those whose smell you don't notice because it's so much like your own, those whose smell you do notice and you don't like, and those whose smell you do like and might even turn you on. Now, how other people smell obviously depends on things like personal hygiene, but two other factors are just as important: the food they eat and beauty treatments. If someone's smell is not to be uncomfortable for you, it's best that for some months they get their system used to eating the kinds of food that you eat, and probably go easy on the more spicy stuff. If someone also gets a daily body massage with fragrant oils, it won't be long before those oils become a part of their system and a part of their personal pong. So food and beauty treatments were the order of the day and week and month. 12 months, in fact. Verse 10. Verse 10 is a little aside which needs to be noted at some point. Esther was a Jew, but the people in the palace didn't realize that, and Mordecai suggested that she kept it that way. Had it been known in the palace, it would have created a stir, perhaps like that when it seemed that Princess Diana might end up marrying a Muslim, although possibly rather more like the fuss that would have ensued had Charles decided to marry a Muslim. Verse 11. The harem was a little closed world, but Mordecai found that he could get news of his cousin if he hung around near the harem courtyard. He probably got on chatting terms with some of the servants who worked there. Verse 12. And so a year passed, because that was how long these beauty treatments were detailed to last. Verses 13 and 14. The trials then began. Each evening one of the girls would go and spend the night with the king. Next morning she moved into the main part of the harem where the king's concubines lived, and would only ever go to the king again if he asked for her. Just imagine how it must have taxed the poor king's memory to have to remember all those girls' names. Dreadful. If you'd like to read now, please, verses 15 to 18. Verse 15. It was then Esther's turn. Some of the other girls, it mentions in verse 13, had been able to take things with them for their trial night. The mind boggles. I mean, presumably some sort of sex aid, but I hate to think. Esther, anyway, decided to play it straight. Verses 16 and 17, she went down a treat, and without delay she was made queen. The king still did not realize that she was Jewish. Over time, she managed to use her influence as queen to deal with someone who was harassing Mordecai and the other Jews. This nasty character had in fact organized a pogrom. And even then the penny still didn't drop. Obviously, when the king's attention turned to Esther, he was thinking about something other than her racial background. The rest of the story is quite complicated. It centres on a palace official called Haman, who persuades the king to issue an edict to say that throughout all the provinces of the empire, Jews were to be slaughtered. Esther first manages to turn the king against Haman and have him executed, and then she tells the king about the effect of the edict he'd been tricked into signing, and he's absolutely horrified. According to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which governed their empire, no law passed by the king could ever be overturned. Sounds a bit like the intricacies of papal infallibility. So the king can't revoke the edict, but helped by Esther, he does rush another edict out to all the provinces, instructing Jews that they're entitled to form an armed self-protection force and defend themselves against any who might attack. That was not only permission to arm, but also a heavy hint that a serious attack was on its way. The ploy worked, and Esther had saved the day. And Jews to this day keep a feast which celebrates her success. It's called the Feast of Purim, and it's the only one of their big feasts which isn't based on one of the mainstream acts of the Lord's dealings with them. Why is this book in the Bible? Probably because of the way that Queen Esther was able to get a pogrom called off. For that, she deserves to be treated as a heroine of the Jewish faith, even if she's a heroine in the style of boy's own stories that didn't necessarily happen, but it's a rattling good story. That's the end of our sampling of these 3 books.